Hello, and you're welcome to this short presentation where I'm going to go through climate change and land use policy. It's going to be a very high level overview, as the title suggests, but I will point you towards relevant further reading materials as we go through, should you wish to sort of delve into a bit more detail. So we'll jump right in. An overview. So first we'll look at the national and international context around climate change and land use policies. I'm going to mention a couple of reports, an IPCC report on climate change and land, and then some more recent work that we've done. And I'll finish up by really trying to bring this together by talking about the need for integrated land management, and it's going to be a big challenge, and that is a big challenge for the future in this area in terms of climate change and land use policies in Ireland. So the international context, really big picture, the Paris Agreement in 2015. So here we have the commitment from countries who are signed up to this to try and limit warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And this is to be achieved through what are called nationally determined contributions. So each country submits, essentially, this is what we're going to do, this is how we will play our part. The EU at the same time also has mandated that member states must cut emissions by 55% by 2030, which is very ambitious, and a commitment to net zero by 2050. So that international commitment to net zero was very strong. The national context, lots of different policy documents out there. There's the Climate Action Plan, for example, which is a roadmap. We have Ag-Climatize for the agriculture sector, but the legislation that ties much of this together is the legally binding path to net zero emissions no later than 2050. And this comes from the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act 2021. As part of this, emissions budgets for each sector had to be set. And so we saw last year agriculture and most other sectors have their ceiling set, and that's a 25% reduction by 2030 for agriculture. The land use sector has not been set yet. There's a lot of work ongoing at the moment to come up with that number. I know I've jumped into terminology already, so I'm conscious of that, and I want to just briefly just check a few of these terms, make sure everyone is okay with them. So essentially, the Kyoto Protocol preceded the Paris Agreement in many ways, and this is where we had a system developed for counting greenhouse gas emissions from each country. This placed agricultural activity in a separate category to land use change, and forestry. So you'll see this acronym LULUCF pop up time and time again. So for example, in a grassland, a parcel of land, if we're spreading fertilizer, any emissions associated with that would be under agriculture, but any soil carbon sequestration that's happening in the same parcel of land will be under LULUCF. So this is quite important, a distinction. This remains the international standard and is therefore used by the EPA in their preparation of inventory reports. So we don't have control over that. It has to be agreed at a really high level under the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. There are moves in the EU and other parts of the world as well to use a different categorization known as AFLU, and this combines agriculture, forestry and other land use. And I, for one, believe this is more sensible from a land management perspective. So I hope that does happen, and it seems to be moving in that way. So it's less artificial when you think about how we actually manage an individual parcel of land. So you'll see these acronyms dropped in, but that's just a little background. I wanted to mention very briefly the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. This was part of the 6th assessment cycle, which has just been completed. It was the first really in-depth analysis of climate change and interactions with land. Ireland was one of the 7 countries who requested this particular report be done by the IPCC, and they supported this, including my own research fellowship at the time, to be involved in it, and we had several authors contribute to it as well. But it's a very useful resource. Don't have time to go into detail on it here, but I'd highly recommend having a look at it. One of the things I wanted to pull out from that very briefly is around land use change. Now, this figure, essentially each line represents land use change from 2010 to the end of this century, and is relative to the baseline there of 2010. And in this particular scenario of land use change globally, it's consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So The main line I want to draw your attention to is the green line there, P, for pasture. So you'll see a massive decrease in pasture land by the end of the century in this scenario. What's happening there is that land is being converted to forestry and bioenergy to balance the books essentially on a global scale. At the same time, the same amount of food needs to be produced. In fact, more food needs to be produced. So intensification is happening in large areas of the world as well. So there's lots of complex trade-offs happening. And really the message from this slide is that we're not alone in Ireland when it comes to really challenging land use change that we may have to go through in the next century. We're not unique. We have our own specific circumstances, of course, but the challenge is global. Part of that was dealt with in recent work as part of the Land Use Evidence Review. So this particular piece of work was just published in March, and I'm going to pull out a few key pieces from this. But again, don't have time here to look in great detail. But the chapters covered everything from current land use, greenhouse gas fluxes, to what we expect climate change to do to our land system, and then scenarios for net zero, as well as policy development and sort of trade-offs, which is really important in the last couple of chapters. So here's the current situation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for Ireland in agriculture and LULUCF. And when we combine them in this way, we have AFLU essentially, and it's a major net emitter, which is a big problem. Some of the key sectors for emissions there are enteric fermentation, which is methane from mainly cattle, but also sheep. We have grassland emissions, which are mainly driven by organic soils under grassland. And then we have agricultural soil management, things like spreading of slurry and chemical fertilizer applications and so on. Forestry is an important net sink. That is not enough to offset the significant emissions we have. So what we did in one of the other chapters then was look at how would you get to net zero by 2050 by changing your land use and land management. So the ones we looked at here were things like afforestation, peatland rewetting or restoration, what we called agricultural optimization, which involved a 30% up to a 30% increase in production efficiency and 30% decrease in the total number of ruminants. And we also looked at the combination of these and a few more. The only way to get to net zero was through the combination of highly ambitious actions in all of these. So that was S4D. Don't have time to get into much detail with you on what that means in practice, but I will say this, it's much simplified, but this is required at this stage just to start the conversation on how we're going to get to net zero by 2050. So a lot of further development can be done to fine tune this, but it's certainly very challenging, and there's a lot to be done to get there. Another way to look at this was just simply in terms of the mean annual CO2, and you'll see again the little black dot there indicates net zero has been reached, and that only happens for S4D. So forestry on its own, optimizing our livestock production on its own, not enough to get us there. Even if we re-wet almost all our peatlands, it's not enough. We need to do all of those things at once, which is a very significant challenge. We also looked then at what would be the potential synergies and potential trade-offs from such large levels of land use change. And I'm not going to go through this table in detail, just to point out that where you have things like, for example, potential negative impacts on water quality, biodiversity, that might be where you're increasing your livestock density. So you'll see the little negative symbols there for that one. Others are generally synergistic or positive, such as peatland restoration. You'll see that tends to have positive impacts on other things like mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and water quality. So that really is a positive story. It's a win-win. It's going to be a challenge to roll it out, no doubt. But in terms of these specific things we looked at, there's a lot of potential for positive impacts across multiple challenges. So to maximize synergies and minimize trade-offs, we need targeting of actions, and they need to be matched to the land's capacity. And this essentially requires an integrated approach to land management, or we have a serious risk of negative impacts. So it's complex. There's a lot of more research required, and it needs to happen quickly. And that research really needs to focus, I think, on rollout, and obviously we need the the basic and applied research as well to improve our numbers on these things. But we also need more focus now on actions and making sure they're not having negative impacts as we go along. And I think that's where the positive interactions with some of the result-based payment schemes can really come in and come to the fore, because that type of approach is this type of tailored approach that we need. So in conclusion then, globally and nationally, the commitment to net zero by 2050 is very strong. So if Ireland doesn't achieve that, we're at real risk in terms of reputational damage globally, I would say. It also may not limit global warming. That may not even be enough, because the nationally determined contributions at the moment aren't even ambitious enough. So the challenge is really stark. The land system is particularly challenging in Ireland because we have major emission sources from our land system. We have significant challenges if we're to meet net zero in the land system. And really importantly, this work has shown that if we don't have a guided and targeted approach, we could actually have negative impacts on biodiversity and water quality. So an example here, if we think of high value nature grassland, high nature value grassland even, that's particularly at risk to things like afforestation. And at the same time, the climate impact on the land system are happening already, and they're going to get much worse. So we have to keep an eye on adaptation at the same time and not get blinkered by just our focus on emissions solely. So that's it. Thank you for listening. And as I say, there's a lot more detailed information in the publications there that I've referred to, but I hope this is a useful overview of international and national climate policy related to land use and agriculture. Thank you.